Hi, we have John Buddie with us today. He's willing to do an interview with us. So we're really excited to interview John and welcome. So let's get started talking about your beginning in collies. Can you tell us about the people and the dogs that influenced you most when you were first starting out?
We always had collies growing up, but at some point I was going through an old steamer trunk in our basement. And it was the one my grandmother had brought it when she came to this country from Ireland. And I guess they used it. They would put quilts and things in there for the winter. And stuck in there in a little frame was a 5x7 picture of a white collie with a ribbon from the Bloomingdale's dog show. And Bloomingdale's being just a big department store in New York City. And their third place ribbon was there. It was somewhere in the 30s, I believe. And I was intrigued by it. And so I started asking questions and then, found out that my father, as a young man, had bred white collies. He had a couple of litters and a lot of my aunts and uncles had them. But the ribbon intrigued me. And I just seemed like I wanted to know more about it. I went to the local pet store and I bought my very first book on collies, which was How to Raise and Train a Collie by Sally Barbarisi, now Sally Futh. She became a hero to me right away because here was this lady with these dogs and she did those things. And never in my wildest imagination would I have thought that, 50 something years later, Sally and I are really good friends. And the next thing I started to take was Dog World magazine. And the column in there was by Patricia Shryock, who later became Pat Starkweather. And between those two books, everything built up for me. But that summer, we had gone up to visit an uncle in upper New York State, and we bought a collie from a pet store. And the one thing that I thought she was just beautiful. But after reading those books and looking at the standard, even then I realized she did not look like the show dogs that were out there. And getting another dog at that time, I was, 13, 14, to convince my parents to buy another one was a problem. So I spent most of my time just learning about what was going on. And I joined the Collie Club of Long Island. We lived in New York City proper in Queens, which was not quite like Manhattan, but, pretty limiting. But Long Island was, it was like the key to the Gold Coast. There were so many kennels and famous breeders out there, that you just kind of try to have some of their knowledge rub off on you and learn. And I started going to mat shows, even with the less than stellar show dog, because I learned, and mat shows were very big in the early 60s, and people were so kind, but it was, because it was Long Island, and it wasn't just a mecca for collie breeders. Long Island was a mecca for many different breeds of dogs that really flourished there. So mat shows were one a month, probably. I started going to Collie College. And Collie College was the Associated Collie Clubs of the Northeastern United States. And these clubs, New Hampshire, Maine, New York, would all get together once a year and they would have this 2-day Collie College. They would invite some of the iconic breeders throughout the country to come and speak. And all they had to speak for was about 15 minutes and then answer a lot of questions. And number one, there was so much camaraderie and, you got to talk to people at breakfast or at lunch or in the evenings and stuff. But, you had people like Gus Sigritz and Steve Field, Orrin Kemp, Trudy Mangels. They were the speakers. And, if you were smart enough to be a sponge, you learned. Eventually, I did buy my first show prospect, which was Champion Glen Hill Empress Double Up from Pat Starkweather, and learned a little bit more. But even while showing her, I still was very limited at breeding because I was living at home. I was still in high school, getting ready to start college. So people started asking me to show dogs for them, which eventually led to me becoming a professional handler. And the experience of being a handler and showing some of the top dogs, and more importantly, becoming close with those breeders and watching them develop was huge part of my education. Um, I remember at one point I had a call from a girl who had just moved to New Jersey from California and told me that she was buying this bitch who was gorgeous and I would love her. And would I take her out to these shows in Ohio? And I said I'd have to see her first. And so she got in her car and drove into New York and brought the bitch for me. It was love at first sight for the girl and the bitch, because the girl was my good friend Judy Evans and the bitch was a beautiful Champion Kenrick silver satin. And I took her and showed her, and it was probably one of the best clients early on because she finished in 3 shows with 3 5s. But the friendship that was forged between Judy and I, helped me to learn more things. We both understood the standard. We both had our little interpretation of it, of things we wanted to accentuate. But watching how other people did it was inspiring to me and educational. It also, taught me the importance of looking at pedigrees, especially of deceased dogs, to try and figure out exactly what people did to make things happen. And over the years, handling a few dogs here and there, or having people come to breed to dogs, forged some really close friendships.
Yeah. What about some of the early dogs that really caught your eye and influenced your vision of a collie?
Oh, there were just so many. I'd hate to mention just a few, but when I decided I wanted to get the Glen Hill puppy, it was all these pictures of Glen Hill Dreamers noblemen. But before, I just thought about buying a puppy, I talked to Pat many times on the phone, and she invited my family down to enjoy the weekend. And at that time, she lived in this glorious Victorian mansion on the main line of Philadelphia, be the same home where I would get my first champion years later. But, it was those pictures of noblemen that I thought were so beautiful. And then deciding that was the family I wanted to go with. Um, I went to some dog shows to help Pat and see dogs, and that's where I first met the dog who would have a lasting impression on me, and that was Champion Glen Hill Full Dress. And, people talk about understanding expression and everything else. I read about it, I studied it, I know which dogs I liked, but if I had to pinpoint it and pick a dog, someone, I can't remember who coined the phrase, the best way to learn about expression is through optical illustration. And when I saw that dog, that was it. He was the optical illustration. Mm-hmm. And his picture is still firmly implanted in my mind.
Nice. Let's talk about mentors in the breed. Mentoring, I know, is very important to you, to have a good mentor. Did you have an early mentor in the breed? And can you tell us about that person or persons?
I think my earliest mentors were probably books. I was a good student, but I didn't really love to read. And I think my parents were glad I got involved in collies, because suddenly I was a bookworm. My nose was in books and, reading all the time, looking at pictures, comparing them. I used to have little composition books, the little black and white ones, and I would cut out pictures of dogs in magazines, and I would take them in there and stuff like that. And for a long time, I thought it was kind of silly. But back in 1990, one of the highlights in my life was I got to meet and interview Nancy Caldwell, who bred Silverhoe Shining Arrow, the sire of Silverhoe Parader. And I had a wonderful interview. And when I was leaving, she gave me her copy of Dr. Bennett's book and also her album that had some pictures of her dogs. But just like me, there were all these cutouts of these great dogs, that she had done. Mm-hmm. So I think, the things we had in common were the learning. But, as I became more knowledgeable and had a puppy, of course, Pat was a great influence. And George Horn was another one. They were both in the area. They were both at the heights of their careers. And I loved both family of dogs, but they were both very forthcoming and just willing to share and teach. And I guess somehow they saw something in me that they were willing to do that. And I've always felt blessed because of that.
Yeah. That kind of leads us into cooperative breeding, which is a term you've used a lot, talking about your earlier days in breeding collies. And I know I found the value of cooperative breeding. Can you talk about what that term means and then how it impacted you as a breeder?
I think being so limited in breeding, living in the city, and that was going to stay that way until I was finished with college. I could only do a certain amount of breeding. And probably my first 6 or 7 years in the breed were the most intense years as a student, although my whole life I've been a student. I was very lucky to meet with some early people who had similar visions. It was at Westminster Kennel Club I'm thinking maybe 65, that I saw a blue bitch who I just was crazy about, and her name was Champion Hy-Vee Revet Mist. She was still a class bitch at the time when the Westminster show still allowed class animals to be shown. But, sitting up in the stands and looking down, she just made this incredible picture and she was so balanced and pretty. And so after that, it was a bench show then, and it was 2 days of benching. I went down and introduced myself to Bill Hutchinson and her handler, which was Steve Barger, and that was when that friendship really cemented itself. And Bill invited me down to Virginia to visit the kennel, and that's where I got to meet Mary. From Mary, we were at a show, and George and Rose Solner of Wayside had just moved or just built their home in Terry Hall. And I was invited to go to the party after the show, and that's where I met Rose and George. We've been lifelong friends, and Rose and I, for years, we're joined at the hip. We talked every day on the phone, and I love going to visit there and, go on vacation together. And at that show, Joyce Avery, who used to live in Maryland and knew Mary and Joyce, and who actually had sold Revet Mist to the Hutchinsons, came back for a visit. And, that was, she was so intriguing. The way she could verbalize things to you and paint pictures of dogs. And, she just was really, really smart. But she didn't love to show. And Steve Barger was her handler and very good friend. He was like her adopted son. And he would encourage her to get some of these beautiful dogs and bitches out. But, Joyce was a breeder first. So between these 3 people, with similar ideas, but each one expressing a love of certain characteristics, I was able to join in on the group, and we could breed dogs back and forth, help each other, sit down, if we saw a new stud dog, we would be on the phone or at a dog show and we'd talk about them. And, sometimes we'd have a list of several dogs we'd want to breed to, and Rose would say, well, why don't you breed so-and-so to this dog, and I'll breed so-and-so to that dog. And it went like that, and we could see the results. But for many years, if I had a litter of puppies, the Solners were the closest, and I was always down at their house, and we'd look at puppies. If they had a litter, I was invited there to see that. And actually, the friendship went even farther than that as far as cooperative breeding, because my last year of high school, I had purchased, before that, 2 puppies for Mary Hutchinson when I heard that she was breeding Revet Mist to Champion Glenhill full dress, that my antennas went right up, and I asked, if I could have a puppy. And the other thing I have to add here is I used to go down to Glenhill pretty often, during those years. And Bill and Mary had a daughter who had very serious medical issues and pretty much lived at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia for a long time. So they would come and stay with Pat and then go down and visit their daughter Karen. And, so we talked a lot. So I bought 2 puppies from the litter. And I kept the try. Her name was Tartanside Hy-Vee Classic, and she was really a pretty bitch, long-headed, long-necked, not a lot of body, and unfortunately, she went overshot. But, I talked it over with Joyce and Rose and everything else. And they said, oh, don't give up on her, try and breed her. By that time, Joyce had gotten a dog from the Solners named Rivette's Wayside Traveler. He was sired by Bellbrook's master pilot, who was also the sire of a dog I love very much named Ginger Bellbrook's Choice. Mm-hmm. Well, the Kaivia Classic came in season, at my last year of high school, and I was going away to college in the fall. And I didn't know what to do, and I was going to skip her. And my good friend Joyce Avery, called up and said, look, just get her out here somehow to Cincinnati. And, I'll whelp her. You can breed her wherever you want. And of course, I wanted to breed her to Wayside Traveler, who was there. And she did the breeding. She kept the bitch. She whelped the litter. She sold the puppies, and she kept the best one for me. And that one was Tartanside Tierra, who was the dam of Tartanside the Gladiator. Without people like Joyce and Marion and people like that, it never would have happened. Mm-hmm. But, again, there was this whole thing about using each other's dogs back and forth over the years. And we all did it, several times. And I still remember when Champion Highview the Invader was winner's dog at the National, it was 1968. And Solners had a dog in there that won the open class, and we were all standing at ringside. And when the Invader won, we were all hugging because we all felt like we all had a little piece of this, this little piece of the pie. And it made it, really special.
Right. What about, later friends who may have helped and aided, and you kind of shared some breeding programs? You shared some dogs with them, and the dogs kind of went back and forth. Can you talk about some of those people?
You know what? I've always believed in the saying that no man is an island. And because I had to keep numbers small, that stuck with me throughout the years. I never wanted a whole lot of dogs. I never wanted a litter. I just wanted to breed a couple of special ones that could make a difference. But I also realized I couldn't do it on my own. Those early years when Tartanside the Gladiator was around, his co-owner, Carol Hook, was a big part of things because, the dog primarily lived with me during the year, but would go and spend his out-of-coat months down with Carol where, he was a loving house pet. She had a beautiful home on the St. Johns River. And when I would go down, Buster would often be laying out on the dock on the water, just watching things go by. And, I got to see show dog, family, pet all combined. But we did a lot of puppies back and things like that. And later, when it came to Champion Tartanside Heir Apparent, it was a lot involved with him. He needed test breeding and the whole thing. And I was able to, because she was interested, co-own him with Diane Fitzpatrick of Alphenlock. And the dog's call name was Snapper. He went to live with Diane. She kept him in glorious condition, promoted him, showed him, got his Canadian championship, and did some really special winning with him. And, from the breedings that she did emerged some of these beautiful families. And, during those times too, if I couldn't make up my mind on a breeding, I would often check with Diane because I wanted her input. We just seemed to see the dogs in the same vein. So, as I said, no man is an island. And years after that, I had friends who either bred into my family or maybe got foundation stock from me. Pat Leonard, Grace Casa, Walt and Laurie Goodell, Fran Hughes, Cookie Jones, Michelle Struble, Dave and Krista Hansen. Those people were very generous by wanting to stay loyal and pay back and whelp litters for me and sometimes took an extra puppy. So, it may look like these were just my dogs, but without all the help I received, they never would have done what they did.
Yeah. So let's kind of move on to kennel hopping. I've heard a lot of great stories from you about your kennel hopping trips all over the country, going to Chicago in the summer and, going into the Midwest. A few years ago, Debbie Holland and I kind of tried to repeat the trip, and we went out east and saw some families of dogs, and we just came away with a wealth of knowledge and understanding about those dogs and how the dogs are kept and other breeders' visions. Can you tell us about some of those kennel hopping trips and what you walked away with?
In the early days, where I lived afforded so many different opportunities. And I learned a lot of things during those trips, but they didn't really click in until I was actually becoming a breeder. We were fortunate in having match shows at Mrs. Gray of Woolies Lane and Mrs. Long of Noranda were very famous fixtures on Long Island for many years. And, both had bred national specialty winners and so forth. Both had horses as well as collies. And so, going to a match show there, you not only got to see the dogs, but you got to see the horses. And Mrs. Long often, she rode, quite regularly, and she would take the dogs with her. And I remember Les Canavan telling me that, they had to do certain things and figure out how to jump a fence or jump through it. And she said that there was once a bitch that she really loved, and Mrs. Long didn't keep it. And when Les questioned her, why would you do that? I can't remember the exact answer, but she wouldn't take the jump or she wouldn't go through the fence. And, that was important to her as far as their agility.
Mm-hmm.
But then, over those years on Long Island, the big names there, Trudy Mangles had started on Long Island and moved up to New York State. But all these people that started basically with poplar dogs from Mrs. Browning's daughter, Mary Beresford, had their own lines going. One of them was Les Canavan with Royal Rock. And, Les was at her heyday when I first started. She was still handling dogs, including Mrs. Long's champion, Aranda's Daily Double, who was sired by Les's champion, Royal Rock Gambling Man, who was really a very popular sire at the time. He was by an Aranzone dog, and I loved going to Aranzone because Brian was from Ireland, as was my grandmother, and somehow that Irish brogue always made me feel kind of warm and fuzzy. But they were very distinctive dogs with really beautiful outlines and balance. And Brian's dog, he never went in the ring with bait. He would have practice with his dogs at home, and his kids, he'd have them on a lead and he'd have his kids run around, and the dogs would stand up and watch them. And so when Brian would come with one of his beautiful Aranzone dogs in the ring, he would stand back and he'd sort of hold the lead, and the dog would go to the end of the lead, surveying it, looking for the kids or whatever. And it was a beautiful picture of natural elegance and balance. And then there was Edith Levine, who had the Glen Knowles collies, also starting with poplar dogs. And she had a very distinctive line of dogs based on a dog called Glen Knowles Knightswood Skye. And Knightswood Skye was bred by another Long Island breeder, Sue Mitchell, who owned Silver Buckle, that was the dam. And, they had beautiful dogs. We used to have a lot of collie club meetings at Knightswood Kennel. And that's where 2 weeks before the meeting, we had a magazine called Collie Call. And it would be at Sue and Mike's that we would go out and work on the magazine using the old purple, not mimeograph, Rexograph machines, and we'd be round and round piling them out, and then we'd have to staple them and put them together. But it was another meeting, and it was fun. And we got to talk about other people, but throughout all these times, we also got to see lots of puppies. However, one of my favorite places to go, or one of many, was in New Jersey. I would meet the Sulners down at George and Ginger Horn's Ginger Kennels. They lived in southern New Jersey, and the kennel buildings were old chicken houses because that part of New Jersey, there were lots of chicken farms and apple farms, things like that would come up in the fall. But these chicken houses or farms, when they converted them, the indoor pens were huge, like 10 by 10 or 10 by 12. And, the dogs didn't have runs all the time because George didn't feel like they got the right exercise. So they would turn the dogs out into a bigger exercise field. But my first visit there, I remember walking into the first building, and the first dog to greet was Champion Ginger Bellbrook's Choice. The dog had just a stunning headpiece that was so different from other people's dogs at the time. It was long, it was lean, it was clean, it had a beautifully rounded muzzle. Next to him that day was a young dog named Ginger's Gunslinger. And he was a repeat breeding on the dog in the third pen, who was Champion J. Dean's Breeze Along. Barbara Woodmansey had bred a bitch to Bellbrook's Choice, and Breeze Along was the puppy. And George showed Breezy for 2 or 3 years for Barbara Woodmansey. And eventually he and Ginger were able to purchase the dog. He was a magnificent dog. I mean, he was a real picture book collie with a beautiful color. And, you know, whenever you went to Ginger, the dogs were in sparkling condition. And then, you know, there were many pretty bitches in there, including Greg Shar's little Honeycomb, who was the dam of Breeze Along. She was a beautiful bitch, really typey. And, you know, even in limited knowledge, you could tell that these dogs were special. And you could go through that building into another. And in subsequent years, you know, he had made some changes. Van Dyke had a dog called Humax Mr. Esquire that I had seen at his kennel. And George bred to that dog. And from that came Ginger's Indelible Ink. You know, so it gave him a new way of doing things, and bred her back to Bellbrook's Choice and got Ginger's Indelible Choice. And then a good friend of George's, Carl Andrews, he had the Carla Collies in York, Pennsylvania. He had this litter with these 2 beautiful dogs that pretty much came down from the Aranzone dogs. The male was Champion Carla's Blue Eagle, and the bitch was Champion Carla's Blue Ruin. And in the middle of a divorce and making some moves, George was able to acquire Blue Ruin and bred her to Indelible Choice, and that produced the CCFA winner, Ginger's Indelibly Blue. You know, so on other visions, we would see Patrick and Breezy and Bruiser and Hare Indelibly Blue. And, you know, another young dog he had was Ginger's Kismet. But it was always so cool to go in there and get excited to see this lineup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about
and then,
go ahead.
Then, you know, years later, through the dog shows, I got to become good friends with Jim Fredrickson and Jim No, as did the Solners and Judy Evans. So we started going out to visit them in Chicago in the summers. The first year with just the Solners and I, and 1 year Rose and I, and then Judy started coming along as well. And it was like whenever we would make the trip out there, we had a list of places we went every year to see what was going on. You know, the first trip out, I remember going to Gene and Carol Chapman's and seeing the beautiful, especially bitches, and that's mostly what they had at the time. You know, they had sold it to Jim's Enterprise, but they had his sisters, a couple of them, just really Victory Song, and I never got to see Enterprise's Damn Highland Holly, but I would love to have seen her. But, you know, you could start to see how people stamped a look and how they selected for virtues and the similarities between them. From there, we'd go up to Wisconsin to Jenny Holtz and Joan Gravers. And, you know, they bred together and everything else, but between the 2 kennel names, there were differences, and they bred them back and forth. But, you know, my first Glen Hill champion was a granddaughter of Culmore's Conspirator. And that's pretty much, he was the fountainhead for that family. And the dogs in there, you know, today you might not consider them glamorous, but they were just so correct, you know, had beautiful details of muzzle and back skull and a softness that went through there. And then, of course, you know, we went to one of my favorite kennels to visit, which was Viley in the Jabez. The first time I went out there, they had these males sitting there. They were young males, and I just thought they were so beautiful. And they were similar and yet diverse. And there were 3 litter mates. Viley's Modern Man, Viley's Rocket's Reprint, yep, and Viley's Barn Boss. And they were all young at the time, and all 3 finished, but all 3 contributed to it. And there were other dogs in there. I got to see the beautiful Viley's Classic Contender as a veteran. Such length and smoothness of head and round muzzle and skull. But my favorite there was Viley's Duchess Delight. And she was the veteran. She was 12 or 13 at the time, with the smoothest headpiece and the most beautiful eyes that had withstood the test of time. And, you know, all those lessons, seeing the similarities of these beautiful eyes and muzzles, you know, and how she did it. From there, we were off to Twin Creeks, who lived in Indiana at the time. And this started before Grit, and they had combinations of dogs coming down from Enterprise and Lick Creek. They had the white dog, First Frost. And, you know, it was always interesting in those beginning years how Joyce could take all these families and, by very careful selection on her part, created this Twin Creek look where they all looked similar regardless of the background. A great lesson in selection. We would visit Bertha Garrison, who was then Bertha Frank, and the Bandor Collies, and seeing some of her early ones. And then one year, I remember on the way home, we stopped at Lick Creek. And at the time, Mrs. Sturm and daughter, Sue Barlow, had different dogs at each house. And I remember when we went to Mrs. Sturm's house, everything there had to do with a beautiful tri-dog named Lick Creek's Pizzazz. And at Sue's, everything revolved around the CCFA winner champion, Lick Creek's Drummer Boy. Coat and bone and body like you just didn't see in a lot of other dogs. And they were very typey and, again, very similar. So basically, on the whole, all these kennel trips helped me to understand distinctiveness, typiness, and the memories still are exciting to me about those early days.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit. And you've talked about a golden age of collies, or the last golden age of collies. Can you define what is a golden age? And what do you believe was that era of golden age of collies, and why?
It's, you know, the golden ages really have to do with a certain time in dogs. And, you know, I think early on, the golden ages were probably around, you know, the 1920s, when the moneyed people in our breed were importing dogs to this country. And that was a big, you know, it was the era of the importations, which were going to be used to help create what we know as the American Collie. You know, that next era would be followed by the American breeders, who began to establish some of the American lines, and most of them stemming from Mrs. Lunt's Alstead Kennel, because as far as the imports went, most of the ones that really carried forward and moved on at one time or another spent time at Alstead. And, you know, I had a client back in the 80s or 90s that lived in Rahway, New Jersey, where Mrs. Lunt was from. And I also showed a dog for Marion Earl that had the Earlcrest kennels and became friends with Marion. And she was a very close friend of Mrs. Lunt and shared wonderful stories about it. So every time I would go to Rahway to see the client, I was always trying to find her house. I knew where the street was and all, but that whole area had changed and been demolished, and, you know, new buildings stood up. But, you know, there's something about an era that makes it special. And, you know, for me, probably would have been the 1970s. Why? I just remember going to, especially it stands out, the 73 National. You know, I was so blessed that year to be in a lineup of dogs at the National that were stalwarts to the breed and to their own breeding program. You know, those were the years when dogs like 2J's Hanover Enterprise, or Wickmer Chimney Sweep, Clarion's Night Rider, Lick Creek's Pizzazz, Antrim All the Way. You would go to the shows and see these dogs, and they were all beautiful, but they all, again, had a distinctiveness about them, and they spearheaded families, which made a difference. And I think in those days, you would breed to a family for a characteristic. You could take your bitch and think, oh, I can't decide if I should breed her to Blind Hill Dreamers, Nobleman, or Emperor Jones. And, a lot of times people in those days would ship the bitch and ask the stud dog owner, call me and tell me what you think. And they would usually go along with it. And it was just different. People often ask me, is the overall quality better or worse than it was? And I don't know that there's really a way that you can measure that. I think overall in the medium field, we probably have better quality because we have less really poor dogs. I think newer breeders today are very lucky in that they start off with, much better foundation stock than some of the early breeders did. And I also think a lot of times if you study history, which is a major thing for me, and it's still interests me, a lot of those early breeders had kennels of 80 to 100 dogs. A lot of those dogs had different problems and they didn't all reproduce or whatever. But with all of those dogs, you wonder why their number of champions was small. And the reason I can think of is, number one, you had health issues, a distemper litter could get wiped out or whatever. But they also had a lot of dogs that were breeding dogs. They didn't care if everything in the litter got shown. And they would keep some from a litter just for breeding. Maybe they had, flopped ears or prick ears or whatever, And in those days, 40s, 50s, breeders were not as savvy as we are today on how to make things better. But I do think getting to that level of uniformity, not having so many bad dogs, not having so many great dogs, but what was in the middle was better than what used to be in the middle because they were coming up differently. But sometimes I think that uniformity has undercut the distinctiveness of families. As the generic show dog syndrome, emerged, and the most important values to many revolve around glamour and showmanship and outline, which are important. But they are also the qualities that make it easier to win, which is kind of sad. And they certainly are. And those things were important, and they do make it easier to win. And maybe those dogs wouldn't have been winnable years prior because a lot of the judges were breeders and they were sticklers for certain details because they knew firsthand how hard some of those details were to get and much less keep. But if you really want to create a distinctive family, it's so important to keep the standard and, the important details of the standard in the front of your mind. I can't remember who put up the quote too that said, if you really want to be excited and stimulated, don't breed dogs, breed a family. And that always stuck in my mind. Also, I think in the past, so many judges were revered differently than they are today. And their judging ability, when it was evaluated by breeders, was based on the fact that they had bred families and bred quite a long time before they wanted to become judges. Growing up, I was always taught, go for the opinion. And if you get the nod from certain people, that it means a whole lot more. And for me, I grew up with heroes, and some of these iconic breeders were just heroes to me. And I talked to people of my ilk. We all had those heroes. And, if I watched somebody judge that was one of my heroes, and I didn't understand why they did what they did because it didn't ring true with me, I would never go home and think, oh, they've lost their mind or they've lost their eye. But I would sit and go over it and look at it again until I could make them right, because I always felt like, mother knows best, and so do they. And some of these iconic breeders were also, they could see things in the future. And one of my really exciting moments, having gone through the PRA episode, the dog that emerged victorious was Tartanside heir apparent. And at the 78 National, we had Gladiator there, but we had heir apparent. And in those days, we didn't have reserved seating or reserved grooming. But everybody knew that right along the trophy table, there was a whole row of chairs. And every year they would be used by Steve Field, Isabel Chamberlain, Glenn Twyford, and people of that ilk, and they would carefully watch the dogs as they went around the ring. And I remember showing heir apparent in the puppy class, and I was working my way around the ring, and I suddenly got over near that group of people, and Steve Field called out to me and signaled me, asking me to come closer. And he said, "Let me see him head on." And he looked at the dog, and he said to me, "That one's going to be a good sire." And I thought, how did they know, their intuition, how did they know these things? Years later, I showed Champion Tartanside the Critics' Choice to Alex Gibbs, who was one of my favorite judges. And he said something to me that time. He said, "This dog is going to be the one that's going to carry forth for you." And, it meant a lot to me because their opinion, I could have gotten a 5-point major under somebody else, but just those words of encouragement were so important. And I'm not always effusive with praise. Even in teaching, I used to force myself to write comments on papers because I always felt like, oh, people would just know how I feel, but it's not true. And I do try to make a point and, be encouraging to people because I remember what it meant to me.
Mm-hmm. Right. From time to time, there may come a dog that makes a big shift, a big positive shift in the current landscape of the breed, sort of the right dog at the right time. Can you give us an example of such a dog from the past and what shifts occurred because of that dog?
Well, rather than just going there, I want to talk a little about the drag of the breed. And it was a term that Annie Clark, she created the phrase and used it quite a bit. The drag of the breed is when a certain fault or combination of faults get pretty much steeped in, and it might be across all families or something else. I know, when I first started, there were a lot of cowhound dogs. And, but it changed, but that was the drag of the breed. We had periods when, eyes were big and light and people went to the extreme and suddenly, there were little tiny pig eyes and they were too small. But that became the drag of the breed. In more recent years, I think, there's been some outline changes and things like width between the eye, which is something that kind of bugs me. But I always feel like the next important stud dog who can really make a difference because they'll change the shift in emphasis will be the dog who can help correct on a regular basis. And he has to offer the solution to the problem that's sort of gotten a foothold in the breed. And so it goes on like that. And then, the popular sire syndrome is good and bad because dogs have so many opportunities to breed so many bitches. And I don't believe the people that own the popular sires are necessarily the ones at fault, but some people get to the point where they inbreed on them so much that they begin to lose, hybrid vigor or whatever. And that becomes a problem. And one thing that, I figured out in breeding was that a lot of the families that were so popular and you'd have 3 or 4 generations of these really fabulous stud dogs, and then it would sort of die out. And I think in a lot of cases, when I looked at pedigrees, my favorite thing to do, they bred themselves into a corner and they didn't think early enough about adding some new blood and things like that, even if it was just for hybrid vigor. Creative breeders have often enhanced their program by line breeding to these particular dogs. But it's also important, realizing what you might be losing and trying to keep up with it, is really important. But you also, today, sometimes I urge people when they get something good and it's tightly bred in, and then they start doing some outcross breedings and they've lost what they started with by adding maybe one particular virtue. And sometimes it's just showmanship and glamour. They've lost some of the things that they had and began with, but just assume that the same dogs of today look just like the ones from yesterday. It's not always true.
Okay. Um, let's kind of shift gears just a little bit and talk about we're in an information age. You can Google anything and come up with all kinds of information. We have message boards and lots of instant experts. Can we talk about that difference between disseminating information and knowledge and how that world has changed from when you first started?
There's a big difference, in some of the terms. And, I realized it as a teacher and I realized it as a breeder, and seeking guidance really relies on picking the right things. Information and knowledge are not the same thing. Knowledge comes from experience. Information comes from data. So if you're going to seek information, especially when you go online, you can seek knowledge from someone who has great book learning, and they can spiel off things to you about what they learned from the books. But if you really want to learn, you look to the people who have knowledge, because knowledge is also what gives you wisdom. So you go from experience to knowledge to wisdom. And there's nothing better than learning from someone who's been where you want to be. And it's important to seek that kind of information. And, even in teaching, I never wanted to teach at children. I wanted to make them think, and I wanted them to have an experience, and I wanted them to get the knowledge of what they learned from the experience. And it's the same thing, I believe, in breeding. And, I've always said you can sometimes learn more from your mistakes than you can from your successes. Every obstacle is just a stepping stone to the next success.
Right. Another topic I've heard you talk about frequently is the value of the judicious outcross. Can you discuss some of your impactful outcrosses and how they progress Tartanside?
They're interesting because I've always been a little bit of a risk taker, and I've done some outcrosses, and some of them, newer breeders probably even aware of, such as years ago when I was showing the Clarion dogs for Judy. I loved Silver Satin. And so at one point we decided we were going to cross our two families. And I bred Gladiator's Dam, Tartanside Tierra, to Silver Satin Sun, Champion Clarion's Night Rider. And Judy bred Silver Satin to the Gladiator. We came up with nothing as show dogs went, but we both wanted to keep the other side of the family in pedigrees. And to this day, everything that Judy has and everything that I have go back to that breeding, or breeding on either side. And Judy even said that she kept a blue merle bitch from the litter that was really beautiful, but her bite went even, so she didn't really show her, but she produced 5 or 6 champions. However, there were like 5 sable merles in the litter. And it was at a time where you just didn't keep a sable merle and show it, and we've often said if things were different, and we had it to do today, we would have kind of kept up with that. And for the cross that I did, that's the bitch line that comes down through Tartanside Preview, because his dam went directly back to the Night Rider Tierra cross. So, those were just some. But when I did the breeding that produced the Gladiator, and I don't mean to sound like I was all brilliant because I was as new as anybody else, I really liked a lot of the ginger dogs, Bellbrook's Choice being one of my favorites, but I loved a lot of the Glen Hill dogs for different things. One family for more outline elegance, the other family for head detail and muzzle. So Tartanside Tierra was a 3/4 sister to Highview the Invader. They were both by this Revette's Wayside Traveler, who was a grandson of Bellbrook's Choice and a double great-grandson of Bellbrook's Master Pilot. And they were both out of full dress daughters. So when I combined the two, it wasn't that I was breeding tightly on just full dress or just Bellbrook's Choice or Pilot. I was doubling up on the combination that produced them. So, I had really sort of two outcrosses, but yet, I was doing some careful line breeding. And over the years through breedings that I've done, um, a lot of times I've been lucky enough because my dogs have been used extensively. I can do a half outcross, one that worked great for me. I loved Champion Sealor's Grand Applause, and loved his mother, loved his grandmother, as well as my dogs in the pedigree. But he would always click well because it was a line breeding with a quarter outcross, a 25% outcross. And if you double up on that, then you have more like a 50% outcross. So, those things have worked for me. But um, I also realized, as I said before, sometimes you get a whole thing full of male sires that produce really well, and you can get boxed in. And so there, through an article I read by Espenang, a famous greyhound breeder, I learned the importance of the bitch and that she's gold. And, certain bitches I like to call cardinal bitches. And I've been fortunate to have a couple, dogs that I really wanted to be, bitches that I really wanted to be as important as the males. So I would breed them and then often take their daughters and outcross them. And eventually I would take those outcrosses back to another outcross of the daughter, but I would still be doubling on the cardinal bitch. And then I could take that back to whatever stud dog I had at the time. That has really served me well. And, another lesson, like it's nice to have good stud dogs, but they have to have beautiful mothers, and your bitch lines are really important.
Who were some of those cardinal bitches for you?
Well, Arabesque would have been one. And it's funny because she only had 5 living puppies in her life. And we had 2 sisters by Grand Applause, and that was my partial outcross. One was Audacious, and she was the dam of Tartanside Dauntless, who produced Power Play, who produced Tour de Force, and so on. And the litter sister was Alliage, and she was bred out to Brandon and produced Lee, Champion Tartanside Allegiance. And, the pedigrees I was able to combine and, go pretty heavily on her. And the same thing with Imagination. We did a couple of breedings with her where we could double up and go back.
Okay. So in the course of breeding dogs, sometimes you get that strong feeling like this breeding needs to happen. Have you ever had that feeling, and can you give us an example of that?
I think many times, but the one that comes to mind, it was the lesson in, are you an exhibitor or are you a breeder? And, I was getting up in age, and it was just a lot more work to campaign a male special. And so in one of the outcrosses I did that was very successful to Fantasy Brun's Talisman, I came up with a bitch called Champion Tartanside Foolproof. And she was a great show dog. She never let me down. She was a good mover. A combination of qualities of sire and dam that worked really well for me. And again, went back to Arabesque through her dam. But I was having a good time because she was fun to show in the group. And I always enjoy the outdoor all breed spring shows because I get to talk with the all breed people and other breeds that have established families and stuff, and there's so much to learn. So I was campaigning her and really trying to keep her in the rankings, which was relatively new to me. Earlier dogs that got in the rankings or were number 1, it just happened. It wasn't like I was pushing for it. So we had campaigned her quite a bit, and we went to the National in Columbus. And from Columbus till the end of spring, there were all these great shows for her lined up that, I thought she could do some good winning to get in the ranks. And that was my plan. And I sat at the National and I admired all these young puppies that people had and everything else. And we had bred her before, and, she had produced pretty well. We were halfway home, and I just kept thinking about the dogs that I saw, and I guess you could say my breeder instinct kicked me in the head. And I decided I need to breed her. and I need to breed her to Tartanside Dauntless. Dauntless was actually in the car behind me with Fran Hughes, who co-owned them and who we lived with. And we were about 3 hours from home. And Foolproof was already on day 16. And I thought, this is probably fruitless, but we're going to do it. So, we stopped at Fran's house. We got the tie, which lasted just very short. It was very short. And, Fran said, do you want to do this again? And I said, no. I think if this is meant to be, I've had this gut feeling, and I always believe there is divine intervention. If this is meant to happen, it will. And she had 6 healthy puppies, and every one of them became a champion. But 2 of them, Riviera and Power Play, were so instrumental in progressing things forward.
Yeah. What needs to happen for people who are interested in collies to take on that mantle of breeder? We have a lot of exhibitors. We want these people to commit to influencing the breed and leaving a legacy for the breed. So what do we need to change? What needs to happen?
I think we need to start off by being more welcoming, number one, as breeders. And we don't have the opportunities we used to. There are no more club meetings. And actually, I do see the tide beginning to turn, because I see some of these specialty clubs having dinners and gatherings after the show and making people feel welcome. But you also have to realize we've moved into an era where numbers and statistics often outweigh being a breeder of distinction with a family. And, I think today young people say to me, you know what, I would like to get into this, but I just can't. I don't have the room. I don't have the money to campaign all these dogs. I'll never have enough dogs, to be a top breeder or anything else. And somehow we have to realize that, numbers do tell a story. We have some remarkable breeders who, can breed a remarkable number of champions and get satisfaction from that. But then, that's never been a goal for me, because my mentality is still the 14-year-old kid in New York City that doesn't want to keep a lot of dogs, and I never have. But I've learned, if you're smart and if you're really picky and selective, it can happen for you. And selection is the key. How much you want to put into it is the key. Can we take a break? Question 2 about, getting people into it. I wanted to save something to read that my friend Julie Desi, who has beautiful Shelties, responded to. And this was her quote. One thing that has not changed is that success has always been fueled by strong intention. Those who succeed are not whiners who cry politics and make excuses, but are dreamers who support those dreams with hard work and sacrifice. And it is hard work. And a lot of times it is sacrifice, but the rewards are just so worth it. Doing this for all these years, I'm still excited about so many things. And while I may not breed myself, watching what other people have done by using some of my dogs and seeing the different breedings they've made and different directions that they take is still exciting to me. So, while we have a strong group of people that are really savvy exhibitors, try doing more breeding. It's not just about the ribbons, because after a while they get stale, and the satisfaction really has to come from within. And even up till now, I have watched people come along and do things with dogs that, have just amazed me. So don't breed dogs, breed a family.
I like it. We can make shirts that say that. Okay. So, John, at what point in your career in collies did you decide that you wanted to judge, and how has that changed your perspective?
Judging was never something that was on my bucket list to do. All I ever wanted to be was a breeder. But age does funny things to someone. When you get to the point where, I'm not as good running around the ring as I used to be, and, taking care of the dogs becomes a little bit of a problem. And it's time to slow down. I've watched too many people have an exit that was not so graceful, and I just didn't want that to be me. And I thought long and hard, about the judging thing. Wasn't even sure I would like it. And, someone said to me, hey, get your license. If you don't like it, give it up. And that was the way I went into it. But I found I do enjoy it. Since I don't have a lot of litters anymore, it gives me the opportunity to sort through somebody else's breeding plans and, find things that go up there. And I keep learning more things about myself, as time goes by. One of the things that really kind of amazes me is how important it's become to me that I didn't realize was judging the dogs on the day. They all have their days, and I've put dogs up and, not done for them the next time or vice versa. And it doesn't mean I don't like the dogs anymore, but, when you're looking at them on the day and against the competition, time of year, the coat condition, it all plays a vital role in it. Never believe that you don't have a chance under a judge, because I'll tell you one story. When I was showing champion Tartanside the Gladiator, we showed him to Dr. Greathouse 3 times, and he dumped him every time. Usually, I think on 2 occasions, he put a class dog, which was one of his sons, over him for the breed. But I remember reading his critique at the National in 1964 when he talked about putting up the Clown Prince of Floravale, and he said, I've seen this dog on a couple of occasions. I haven't given him top honors, but on this day, he was in such coat and such condition. He had moved all the others and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, he judges them on the day. Well, in 1974, he was doing the National. And Carol Hook and I had a bit of a go-round because I wanted to enter him, because I just remembered that critique. And Buster won, Gladiator won. And his critique was almost identical. I've seen this dog before, but never, looking this glorious in this coat and everything else. And I guess that always stood with me, and I find myself doing the same thing. Sometimes it's just a matter of, the dog needs another year or more coat or whatever. But I do enjoy it. And, I don't feel like it's giving back as a lot of people do. I feel like it's a privilege. Maybe I've been lucky enough to earn this privilege, that other people will allow me to sort through them and give them my opinion for what it's worth.
So tell us, what was your most exciting moment as a breeder or as a handler?
As a breeder was probably the day we finished the test breeding on champion Tartanside heir apparent. You needed, I can't even remember how many puppies you needed. And so, it was hard enough finding blind bitches, but we finally got one. She missed the first time. The second time she had 3 puppies, and then she had 5 puppies. And then finally on the third time around, we had enough. And, he was already 3.5, close to 4. And we hadn't used him. So, that was like just fabulous.
Yeah.
And one of the most exciting wins, rather than wins, in 1972, I went to the National in Louisville, and I remember I drove down with Sue and Mike Mitchell of Knightswood Kennel. And I had Gladiator entered as a special. I was a nobody. He was a nobody. He had just come up from Florida and everything else. And Steve Field judged. And we didn't have awards of merit or anything else, but you knew who were the ones in contention. And at the end, after going through all the dogs, and in those days, you didn't leave the ring. We didn't have groups. He went over you and everything else, and then you went to the side of the ring and you sat down. So all these dogs are sitting out, and then it was time to stand up to make his decisions. And he pulled out the Gladiator and the beautiful champion Wickmere chimney sweep. And it came down between the 2 of them, and my heart was in my mouth because I felt so out of place. I don't belong out here. This is a big, important dog. And he he made it very clear that this was a tough decision. And later at another specialty, he reversed it, again, the dog on the day. But, it was suddenly realizing, oh my God, I'm coming this close to winning a national.
Right. If you could bring back any one of your dogs or a dog owned by someone else, who would it be and why?
I would like to bring back a Champion Glen Hill full dress because I would love to look into that face again, see those eyes, and have him stare at me and figure out some way to be able to use him. And I'd probably want to bring back Tartanside the Gladiator because even though he was a PRA carrier and I wouldn't have wanted to use him anymore back in the day, we do have DNA now. And I thought if I really felt the need to use him for what he had to offer, at least I could weed it out a whole lot quicker than going through 2 years of test breeding.
Right. Yeah. You've had a lot of impactful stud dogs that have had a strong influence on Tartanside and helped create other families. Who do you feel was the most influential sire of your family of dogs?
It's interesting because knowing this question was coming, I also did a little research on it. I knew who my answer was, but I wanted to have something to back it up with. I think a lot of people might think I would choose Gladiator or Critics' Choice because they both had big numbers, but numbers don't always tell the story. And that's the other thing I encourage people today. Don't get caught up in the numbers. To me, it's, how a dog can be used and influence something will give you greater satisfaction. That's what something mentors always taught me, that influence will give you greater satisfaction than numbers and rankings. And in the long run, a greater sense of achievement. Anyway, if I could pick one out, it would probably be Champion Tartanside Heir Apparent. And he was a great one. Why numbers don't count? Because he had very limited use. He was 3.5, close to 4, before we did the test breeding. And, at that point, Diane Fitzpatrick of Alphenlocht also believed in the dog. And she actually helped finish up his test breeding in Canada. And he only sired till he was about 7.5 or 8, before he was no longer fertile. So his number of champions was not huge. But, being the pedigree nut that I am, I carried pedigrees forward, stemming down from him. And I think here at Tartanside, he gave us a trio of sons, Critics' Choice, apparently, and Spellbound, who were all multiple champion producers, and playing those dogs back and forth made a big difference in the direction that I was going in. But I also remember when the Durazanos decided to breed the extra gorgeous Champion Stars Blue Jeans to him, I was so excited. But Danny Cardoza kept the bitch that to me was the most influential from generations down, and carried Blue Jeans through so many generations through breedings that he did, and breedings that Dan planned, outcrosses, line breedings, and so forth. And she was, a real contributor, and yet another one without a title. As I said, pedigrees are a big thing for me. And I used to always try and get butcher paper because they would roll it out to wrap the meat up when I was a kid. And then later when I was a teacher, the elementary teachers always had the big rolls of this cheap, inexpensive paper that they would put on the easels for the kids to paint on, but I could take out big pieces of it. And I loved doing 6, 7, and 8 generations pedigrees. I always found it interesting. And in later years, looking at those pedigrees, when I knew a little more about the dogs and breeding plans, it really hit home for me about how interesting it is. But anyway, when Diane Fitzpatrick had Heir Apparent up there, she used him beautifully. And, through a combination of his offspring, she created Alphenlocht Masterpiece. Masterpiece is on the dam side of Champion Fantasy Bronze Talisman. So, I'm proud that Heir Apparent appears 5 times in Brandon's pedigree. I don't take any credit for the breedings that Debbie did and the other crosses in there, but it's still interesting to see. Knowing that, I looked a little further and did some checking on current dogs today. Champion Southland Bowen Island has 15 crosses to him in his pedigree. And his son, Champion Barksdale Lochlear and Liaison, has 28 crosses to him. and I just thought it's really, really interesting. But then I looked at some important and influential bitches in history. Um, Rosebank, Lochlear, Keep It a Secret. Fallon was always one of my favorite bitches, and I was really happy to see that, he appeared 11 times in her pedigree. And even your bitch, Jenny, the beautiful, Fresh Powder of Paray, who won the national this year, has 40 crosses to him, which was kind of amazing. But the real tickler came with this year's, I think she's number one, is Trish Blakely's bitch, Larkspur, Sun, Moon, and Stars, has 112 crosses to him. And a lot of that has to do with other people involved. My friend Joyce Dowling, who has been a close friend for many years and somebody I constantly, pop ideas off of and go back and forth. But, she was able to mold a whole Shenstone family using offspring of heir apparent. A lot of critics' choice in our first breeding was to Gladiator. But, she created her own family coming down from that. And, with Trish breeding some of that family back to Bowen, it really multiplied the crosses in there.
Right. Right. So is there a fault you would never breed to, no matter how many other virtues are present?
I never say never. And it's the same thing I remember years ago. Ben Butler and Isabel Butler had moved east. They had the Kinmont collies, and they had champion Kinmont Shane, who basically was a Pareto bred dog and sired the beautiful Country Lane Meliss, one of the first bitches to win the breed at our national. But they were great people to know, and Isabel was also, a really good speaker, but so was Ben. And he spoke at a seminar, and I still remember this. It had to be, 45, 50 years ago. He said, first of all, I want to tell you all that I am a terrible judge. I put up dogs with cowhocks and bad ears. I put up dogs with straight fronts and lacking in muzzle. I put up dogs with a lighter eye and whatever. And he said, it's not always by choice. Sometimes it's all you have to work with. And other times the virtues are so outstanding that you get to overlook things. And I always remember that. And I thought, sometimes I said, oh, I could never do this, but I'm finding out in judging, yes, you can, because I'm not paying as much attention to the faults. But, a dog will come in and have a particular virtue that just hits me smack in the face. And that's it. I can see past almost anything. As a breeder, I've had a couple of things that drove me crazy, and some I gave up on, some I spent a lot of generations breeding out. One of the pet peeves, I guess, for me is a light eye. It's very, very hard to get rid of, because I had a bitch that came up with a light eye from an outcross, but I liked her, and I bred her back to her father. Bred her back to her mother's father, her maternal grandsire, and doubled up on that. And, I had a puppy that was better, and the eye was a little bit darker, but as she got older, it got lighter. So I did one more close inbreeding, and it still never got back to the darkness that I wanted. And one of the things I learned, of course, is, eye color and stuff is sometimes a blending factor and not just a dominant or recessive. But I can tell you from experience, it's hard as hell to get rid of. And I am an expression person, and, dark eyes say a lot to me. A couple of years ago, I ran into, some dogs coming up with higher tail sets. Not sure where they came from. For a while, I got caught up in, I need to figure out what breeding I did that brought this in. But like PRA, I realized it doesn't really matter where it comes from. You got it. Now you got to figure out how to get rid of it. Don't always look back, look ahead. So I did a couple of breedings, and I knew I could get, be safe in getting the tails right. And I would get the tails right, but I would lose in eye and expression. I couldn't get them to come out the same. But you know what? I'm a determined kind of a person, and I just carried on until finally, I was able to keep, some of those dogs in the pedigree, but eradicate the tail issue. Not everything comes overnight. And, especially in judging, and I realized this earlier, I sat and watched one dog that I had with a bad tail set, and I sent him in the group with somebody. And I had talked myself into, well, if you have to get all the way to the end of the dog, to the tail, is it that big a deal? And then I suddenly watched this dog in the group, all these dogs making beautiful go-rounds with, great reach and drive. And suddenly, boing, up went the tail, and it destroyed the whole side picture of the dog. And I thought, I can't deal with this. And I think, those eye openers are important to a breeder. They help you when your selection, and they help you to be more stringent. That's another lesson for the new people. When you get it going, find somebody who you trust and have them show the dog so you can see it, so that you're not fooling yourself, because kennel blindness is one of the worst sins for a breeder to catch. It's like the coronavirus. It takes a long time to get rid of.
Okay. What do you think helped shape your vision of a collie? Were there certain dogs that contributed to that, or still do, and has it changed over time?
You know what? I think it's an evolving thing too, because, I started out with a pet, then I got involved with a lot of the Glen Hill dogs because I loved noblemen. And of course, when I got to know a little bit more and saw full dress, I was hooked. But, through the cooperative breeding plan too, my 3 little cohorts, we would sit and talk about dogs. And sometimes I'd see a dog and miss it. And they would say, go look at it and really look at his eye or his muzzle or whatever. And all those discussions, kind of enhance your appreciation for certain things in the breed. And it takes a while to enhance your template. But somewhere along the line, I had a mental template of what I particularly wanted to do as a breeder. And so I sought the different directions to do it. However, I was very blessed, not only having good people to advise me, who took me seriously, and who shared with me. But later, finishing high school and going to college, when I couldn't really carry on much of a breeding program, I had, I guess, some talent as a little handler and everything, and people asked me to show dogs, and eventually I did become a professional handler. The experiences of seeing dogs of different families and watching people develop them gave me a much greater appreciation, for the dogs. And I always remember back in the 60s and 70s, I showed a lot of dogs from different families to the same judges. And it was true then and it's true now. The good ones of any family will win under a good judge, period, because a good judge sees past this family or that family or this look or that look. And I think that's important. And, seeing those dogs early on, I think, being a baby boomer and involving when I did, we didn't have all the grooming tools we do today. And, I know now when people want to look at puppies and stuff, they want the ears glued up and the head trimmed and sometimes the face is painted. But it used to be sort of a game, a mental game with each other, where we'd all evaluate a litter. Yeah, puppies, some had flopped ears, some had prick ears, whatever. Whiskers, the whole thing. And it was, well, let's see who's going to pick what and who can find the diamond in the rough. And we all became pretty adept at finding the diamond in the rough. So right then, it's, oh, sure, they're prettier when they're all done up. But sometimes I worry that people may not be able to find the diamond in the rough. And are they attracted to the haircut or the grooming, or whatever? And, that has a lot to do with it.
Right. Right. What about regrets? I have them, wishing I'd bred this one to that dog or not shown this one as much. Do you have regrets and any lessons learned?
Yeah, I have regrets about being a sore loser when I was first starting out, and embarrassing myself and feeling like an idiot. There aren't a lot of breedings that I wasn't able to do, but there's one that stands out, really heavily in my mind. I admired very much a dog called Shenstone's Bit of Intrigue. And, he went back to a lot of my dogs, and Joyce Dowling is someone I consider a master breeder. And she had created some really beautiful things in that dog that were hard to get. He was his own worst enemy at times because he wasn't always the best showman, but he was a really honest, beautiful dog with beautiful length and cleanness of head and smoothness of muzzle. And so, I did use the dog. Arabesque was bred to him and produced a champion daughter and a son who never finished, but sired really well.
Absolutely.
But absolute, right. But I wanted to breed champion Tartanside Imagination to him. She was a bitch that was winner's bitch and best puppy at the national, and just really, typified the things that I really wanted. And Pat Starkweather was doing the breed at the national. And so she went in for the breed and she pulled her out and everything. And later she said to me, she is just beautiful. She said, she is like a reincarnation of Full Dress. You want to talk about having your day made? That was almost better than winning the national. That, just and a lot. So in any case, she had produced well for me, but I really, for her last breeding, she was getting up there, wanted to breed her. It's a bit of intrigue. And I called Joyce about it, and the dog was getting older and his sperm count was pretty iffy. But she said, I'll get it checked and call you back. And when she called back, she said, it's not great news. It's, really iffy and blah, blah, blah. And, if you want to change your mind, you won't hurt my feelings or anything. Then I learned something about myself because I thought about where else I could breed her, what I could hope for and everything else. And I came to the conclusion, I don't need another litter of puppies. She doesn't have to have another litter of puppies. I really want to breed her to this dog because if I get what I think I'm going to get, then it will propel things forward and make me feel better. So we did it, and she missed. And I've often thought, do I regret it? Do I regret it? Yeah, a little bit. I regret that it didn't happen, but I don't think I would have done it any different. Breedings are things I think about for a long time before it comes time.
Yeah. So what are you grateful for in your life and dogs?
The first thing is, I feel blessed because, as a kid, I wasn't always very good at all the sports and everything else. I wasn't always the smartest kid. For a long time, it'll probably shock people. I wanted to become a priest. I spent a lot of time as an altar boy, but finally this dog thing came and I was good at it, and it gave me a confidence that I hadn't had before. When I began doing a little handling and stuff, and was told I did a good job and stuff, that meant a lot. I'm grateful for the time I got involved in the breed. I think it was just a wonderful period. And like I said, I got to go through the 70s, but there were so many great people that I got to meet. And, earlier you talked about kennel hopping trips. I was always a kid that had my nose in the story of Belhaven or the story of Taliesin. And Mrs. Browning was still alive. She came to Waconius once and she was at Westminster once. Excuse me, but I was too afraid to talk to her. And so I didn't. But when they passed, I remember going on a visit to Taliesin, and David was with me. And, I didn't mention him in this interview. David was a vital part of Tartanside, was always willing to take the back seat and let me be the front man. But we went up to Taliesin one day, and it had been purchased by a museum curator. And we introduced ourselves, and we told him, we asked him if we would be able to go out and look around. And I knew the layout from videos and things like that. And I remember walking in the fields, and there were still pens up where these great collies roamed, and going in the stud barn. I'm sorry. You're going through the stud barn and things like that. And at one point, David said to me, "Do you hear it?" And I kind of got a grin on my face, and I said, "What?" He said, "Don't you hear the dogs barking and feel like they're here?" And it was true. It was a very kind of eerie feeling, but you were up there, and I thought, boy, I would love to have been here when Storm Cloud and all those great. I would have liked to have been to Taliesin in the heyday, and stand on top of that hill and see Blue Eagle and Storm Cloud and Shower of Gold and some of these beautiful Taliesin dogs. But yet there was this feeling. And a couple of years later, I became friends with Mrs. Ilch's daughter, Virginia. Later, when I got to know nothing. It was years later when I got to go to Belhaven, and I became friends with Mrs. Ilch's daughter, Virginia, who was just delightful. And David and Fran Hughes went with me, and we videotaped a lot. And, you know, she allowed us to walk down. When you pull up to the house, it's a circular driveway, and you would veer off to the left and walk your way down the hill to the kennel building. But terraced all the way down were these little whelping and puppy houses where, you know, the bitches would be out there to whelp. And she said they put a little heater in there in the winter. And, you know, they would be away from the kennel and away from the house. And there were, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 of them. And then you got all the way down to the big. Yes, no?
Just go.
Hmm?
It's okay.
I don't know where I left off. At the bottom of that hill where the puppy pen was the main kennel. And outside was a big, beautiful well that was vine covered. And that's where Mike used to pull up pails of water to feed the dogs in the kennel. We all snuck into the kennel building, although Virginia advised us not to because it was dangerous. But, you know, all the pens were still there. There was a big claw-footed tub for the dogs, which Fran. Okay. This beautiful claw-foot tub that Franny wanted to see if she could buy and take home with her. But the awesome part was looking at all these pens and the thought that, you know, it held Black Lucasen and Lawn Liberation and Magistrate and so many of those Belhaven dogs that were so famous in the day. It really was quite a trick. But then Virginia invited us into the house, and that was even more awe-inspiring. All the trophies, or the majority of them, have been given to the CC of A, but the cabinets were still there, and all of the oil paintings of these great Belhaven dogs were right there in the front room. But the really interesting part was we went into the office, and Virginia had kept everything the way it was the last time her mother was in there. And here was the Belhaven stationery and the pedigrees, and on her desk was a piece of correspondence by her typewriter from the last letter she was writing when she got sick.
Wow. Wow. Can you have some friendships, and you've touched on Franny and David, and it's come up a couple times in the past week or so. There was a Lake George trip, and you have to talk about it because it's pretty famous now. So can you talk a little bit about that Lake George trip?
It was in either 1989 or 90. I have to backtrack. In 1988, David and I had gone up to Lake George because when I was a child, we used to take 2 weeks every summer and rent a cottage up on the lake. And so it was the year my mother died, and I just wanted to go back and try and relive some childhood memories. So off we went in my little Subaru wagon. And when we got right into the town of Hague, where we were going to stay, we had a flat tire. And we stopped to change the tire. And as I was down helping, you know, get the tire changed, I said to David, I swear, I just heard somebody call my name. And he went, we're like 5 hours from home. And about 2 minutes later, this car pulls up behind us, and out of it pops Judy. She was Reed then, now she's Judy Pitt. You know, like, what are you doing up here? You know, she's 6 hours away, I'm 5 hours away. Well, it turned out her childhood was much like mine in that we spent the summers up there. And she told us about this wonderful old house that they rented called Chipwick. And her brothers and their families would all come up. So she invited us to come look at the house. It was huge, and it sat right on the lake. It had its own boathouse and dock. It had the most beautiful front porch overlooking the lake. And then we went in and saw how big it was, and the wheels started to turn. And I thought, wouldn't this be great, you know, if we could get this house next year and, you know, invite some people to come. So, you know, I got home and talked to Judy about it, and she was able to get it and get a price. And then I sat down and figured out, okay, this will be the price, we'll divide it up. And then we should put some money aside for gas and stuff for the boat. And each 2 people will have to bring meals for 1 day of the trip. And so we divided it off in couples, and it really was not very expensive in the end.
Mhm.
Well, I invited Pam and Louis Durzano, Rose and George Sulmer, Nancy McDonald, um, Fran Hughes. And as it turns out, Grace Kossoff was coming back east to go to the Poodle National, which was right by my house, and I asked her to come, and she was all for it. And we all gathered at this big house to enjoy the lake, and enjoy it we did. You know, every day, Nancy McDonald would get up and get on the kitchen table and start throwing flour and stuff around, and would make the best homemade biscuits. And one of us would fry up some sausage and hash browns or whatever. And the mornings, we sat around that table, all of us, just talking dogs and friendships and things. And then we'd plan activities for the afternoon. Nothing revolved around television. We had to be without television for the whole week. And oh, we had a talent show one night. You know, we used to just get in the boat and go boating from time to time. Um, you know, Nancy and Franny went out. They were going to go fishing one morning, and went out on the boat. And I guess the motor didn't start. And we look out and hear these two guys in the boat in front of them tugging them back to shore. And I thought, yeah, engine my foot. And we had a lot of laughs. The Solners were always great fun. And it just was incredible that, you know, all these people thrown together, enjoying each other's company, getting to know each other additionally. And, you know, we had games like win, lose, or draw and categories. It's amazing the conversations that can come up. And I feel so blessed to have been a part of that. I feel blessed about almost all the people I've met in dogs, because they certainly have enriched my life and helped me to be my best self.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, After being in dogs for over a half century and you're not competing the way you once did, what motivates you in the dog world?
Well, I just love the breed. And, you know, someone said to me years ago, I never tired of seeing collies, and neither do I. Pet collies on the street, it's just such a wonderful breed. And, you know, with the internet, you get to read stories about things that they've done for heroism or saving people, or just been there to make somebody happy. I also feel like this breed has given me so much personally that, you know, I'm indebted. And, you know, the breeders that helped launch me always said, you know, you're getting the breed for a certain amount of time, take good care of it, and pass it on in as good a shape or better than the way that you got it. And I took that to heart, as I did most of the things that my mentors would say to me. I just, you know, tried to do it. And so, you know, in giving back, the one the one thing I missed since I became a judge is my handling classes have to be so limited, because AKC has a rule: if you come to a class, you can't show under me for a year. And I hate doing that to people. But for many years, a lot of people in this area know I had handling classes for collies only and a few friends, you know, that would come. And, you know, it was just, I loved watching the people and the puppies grow, you know, into really good show dogs. And then, you know, afterwards we'd all go out to eat and share stories. And I realized then, you know, it brought back some of the camaraderie that we didn't used to have. And, you know, I was never much of a public speaker until I taught school for a couple of years and had a lot of confidence. And I still say I'm great in front of a crowd, but don't put me in a cocktail party and make me work the room, because that doesn't work as well. But I thought, you know, I do have a little bit of a gift or a knack to teach, because I learned how to do it. And I realized, you know, it's important to share your knowledge. And when you share it with people, also be encouraging. And, you know, I hope that, you know, I've made a difference to a couple of people by things that I might have said or taught or whatever. And that, you know, gives me a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah. And the final question, what does Tartanside mean to you?
Tartanside to me is a dream, a fulfilled dream. Um, I think I had told you this before. The last book I put out, master plan originally was going to be uh, in pursuit of excellence, one man's journey. And that's really what it's all about. It's my journey. It's the truth that I've lived. Um, it's a story, about wonderful dogs and wonderful people. And, I hope it's the same for everybody. I've been, one thing I learned early on too was, the whole thing about you can have the top winning collie. You can pin a rosette on the wall. You can have a best in show winner and pin something on the wall, or get breeder of the year, or, the brace club, whatever it happens to be. But if you don't enjoy the journey to getting there, you missed a whole lot. To me, the most exciting years were those early years, being a student, being a sponge, and most importantly, having heroes that were up here. And most of my real heroes have left this world. And I can't tell you how many times when something comes up for me and I want to pick up the phone and ask them, what do you think I should do? I don't ever want to be the one up here. I like being down where I am and having all these people above me to ask the questions to. And, now I just hope that whole pattern continues for people.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to say?
No, my message is the ones that were left for me. Don't just breed a dog, breed a family. Mm-hmm. Encourage people to become breeders. Let them learn, I think if you tell the story of how much you've enjoyed it, being a breeder and in the process, it is the process that really has it. And I've watched some of these interviews before, and the people that have spoke, you can just tell, they're just passionate. And, when they look back and think things back, they get a great smile on their face because of the roads traveled. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful thing to be a breeder. Successful, very successful, minimally successful. You set your own goals and your own steps.
Right. Okay.
And always believe in the beauty of your dreams.
Thank you for your wise words.
Okay.
And thank you for the interview today.
Thank you, Jenny. It was great.